Trust, School Funding Policy in Challenging Times. We are going to give folks a few seconds to come on Zoom and then we'll get started. We really appreciate you all being here. Welcome everybody. We are just going to give folks some time to sign on, but really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Now everybody knows what's behind the green screen. Welcome everybody. We're so thrilled to have you here. We'll be starting shortly. Welcome everybody. We're just going to give some folks a little bit more time to sign on, but really glad you're joining us this afternoon. It's going to be a great conversation. Everything we want and need to know to address the school funding challenges and understand school policy, school funding policy, especially in these times. Really happy to have you. We're going to be taking advantage of a lot of the functions of Zoom today, including polling and using the chat and question and answer. So get ready. Lots of good information to share. And thank you again for joining us. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are at the Education Trust's policy session or boot camp on school funding, policy in challenging times. We are so grateful that you are here to join us this afternoon. Really looking forward to sharing some really great information that we hope as advocates, policymakers, decision makers, we will be able to use to advance progressive school funding ideas and start a conversation about why understanding school funding matters. And let's go ahead and get started. First off, thank you again for joining us today for the Education Trust School Funding Policy in Challenging Times, Tools for Advocates and Policymakers. This is our first workshop and we are really excited that so many of you are joining us. My name is Denise Fort. I'm the Senior Vice President for Partnership and Engagement with the Education Trust, and I can assure you that you are going to leave today's session with some great material to be able to go back home and advocate for great information, the right information, and how to use this information to make things better for students across your states. As all of you know, it has been almost a year since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic in America. And in that time, nearly every aspect of our daily lives, our children's lives, have been affected. This virtual workshop is a testament to the ways in which we, as education advocates, have had to adapt. We're gathering virtually, we're Zooming, and like all of you, we've been Zooming a lot. But even though we're not together in person, we are no less fired up about the work that is before us. It is necessary work. It is that good trouble. It is urgent work. Work to provide every single student in this nation with an education that opens doors to opportunity and that unleashes their boundless potential from preschool through college. But let's be serious and honest with ourselves. Even before the pandemic, as a country, we gave the least to students who need the most. We gave students from low income backgrounds and students of color less access to quality early childhood education, less access to vital resources and supports in our elementary and secondary schools. Even before the pandemic, students of color and students from low income households had less access to the strongest teachers, less access to advanced coursework like AP and IB, and less access to school counselors. And then we also know that these same students receive less access to supports that can ensure a successful transition to post-secondary education. And now, due to this crisis, school districts face steep costs as they adapt to changing circumstances. At the same time, state budgets are likely to be hit hard as tax receipts decline, threatening state aid that supports district operations, particularly high need districts. Today, you will hear from funding experts who will share with you information, tools, and resources that decision makers and advocates can use to ensure equity stays the focus when school districts and states are addressing these difficult times. Our first session on the equity implications of state funding cuts is going to start soon. Ivy Smith Morgan, who's our Associate Director for P12 Analytics, will be joined by Natasha Uzhamirski, our State Director for Massachusetts. She's going to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on fulfilling the promises of the state's recent funding federal reform. We'll then go on and we'll have a short break, but we invite you to return to discuss funding transparency at the school level, hearing from Richelle Presume, our P12 Data and Policy Analyst, who will be joined by Sarah Shaw, Senior Manager of Fiscal and Academic Solvency, the Illinois State Board of Education, where she will be discussing Illinois' great work in this area. And after that session, another short break, but you're gonna have to return because we're gonna end the last workshop on crafting better state funding formulas. Hearing from our own Zahava Stadler, who's our Special Assistant for State Funding and Policy, and John Harchuk, Vice President of Policy, Texas 2036, who's going to discuss Texas' recent experience with funding formula reform. We really appreciate you joining us today. Hope you're looking forward to these sessions with some small breaks. Please make sure you come back each time. They'll be sharing when the times are to come back. And let's get things started. Thanks again.
Okay, so I will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ivy Morgan, and really appreciate you joining this session on protecting high poverty districts from state funding cuts. In this session, I'll spend a bit of time with a quick refresher on what happened during the last recession. I'll highlight what we're seeing now in general and a few specific states. Natasha from our EdTrust Massachusetts team will talk a little bit about the work in Massachusetts defending the Student Opportunity Act. And then I'll introduce you all to a data visualization that we developed to help paint a picture of some of the risks of not keeping equity at the front and center in conversations around funding cuts. I'll close out with a summary of the full set of principles or considerations on equity-oriented responses to budget shortfalls in light of COVID. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat feature. We'll hold time for them at the end of the session, but we'll also monitor throughout and respond to questions that sort of need to be answered in the moment. So what did we see last time, right? We're really concerned with state funding cuts right now because of what we saw during the last recession. First, the bottom line here is that the Great Recession exacerbated the funding inequities that we already knew existed. Between 2008 and 2012, affluent school districts across the country saw their state education dollars drop by about $500 per student. And that's, on average. High poverty districts, on the other hand, in the same state lost more than $1,500 per student, right? So that's a difference of $1,000. High poverty districts saw their state dollars drop by $1,000 more per student than low poverty districts. And that funding, those funding differences, increasing those funding gaps, right? That's important. Money is important because of the other resources it provides, right? Like strong teaching and school leadership, rigorous curricula, early learning opportunities, things like that. And the funding cuts from the last recession translated into educator and school staff layoffs. So again, between 2008 and 2012, the K-12 public education system lost nearly 300,000 jobs. And of those, more than 120,000 were elementary and secondary teachers. And these declines had worse consequences for Black and Brown students and students from low-income backgrounds, right? And part of the reason for this is because the schools that serve those students, right, are on average staffed by less experienced teachers. And when districts rely on first in, last out policies, it means that schools that serve students of color and students from low income backgrounds are going to see the most disruption in their staff. For example, again, during the last recession, in Los Angeles, Black and Latino students were much more likely to see their teachers laid off due to education funding cuts than their white peers. Specifically, right, Black students were 72% more likely to see their teachers laid off, and Latino students were 25% more likely to see their teachers laid off than their white peers. And those cuts also negatively impacted student outcomes, right? We know that funding matters for student achievement. We know that teachers matter for student achievement. So it's no surprise here, right, that the funding cuts that we saw during the last recession had these negative consequences. So one study that specifically studied the impact of funding cuts because of the last recession found measurable decreases in student achievement for all students. The declines were about a little bit more than a month of learning in most grades. There were also measured decreases in college going rates, again for all students, by about 5%. And then the negative effects of spending cuts were larger for Black students here too, right? The Black-white test score gap increased by approximately 6% because of the funding cuts that we saw during the last recession. This was predictable. Why? Frankly, poverty, racism, and our country's history of discriminatory housing and lending practices have suppressed property wealth in communities of color. And over-reliance on local property taxes as a source of district education budgets, district education revenue, really bake those inequities into school funding. States attempt to make up for this in their funding formulas. So what's on the slide here is a graph from EdTrust's latest report on funding inequities between districts. And it shows that the overwhelming majority of states do send more state dollars to their highest poverty districts compared to their lowest poverty districts. And you can see that the sort of magnitude of that difference ranges dramatically across states. But the point is that states do send more dollars to their higher need districts. But the result, right, is that high poverty districts, low wealth districts, which often serve communities of color, are more reliant on state aid. And state budgets rely on income and sales tax revenue. So the main sources of the state revenue that high need districts rely on are the same ones that are most at risk because of the pandemic and the recession right now. Specifically, on average across states, personal income taxes and general sales taxes make up almost 70% of the taxes that states collect, right? And those are the sources that are sort of really being hit hardest by the pandemic and recession. And on top of that, right, on average, about 20% of state spending is spent on elementary and secondary education. So it's really difficult to imagine how states would protect their education funding if state revenue decreases without, sort of other interventions. On the other hand, local property taxes are more stable right now. And what this means is that the wealthier districts in a state will have less of their revenue impacted, and they've got more options available, more flexibility, sort of more room to increase their funding to schools to make up for reductions in state funding. So what are we seeing now? How is this playing out across states? First, I'd like to hear from you guys. So I want to do a quick poll. Let us know, where does your state stand right now regarding funding cuts? What are your state leaders considering? Have they already cut education funding? Can they avoid cuts if they find new revenue? Are they not making cuts to education funding? Or are they likely to make cuts to education funding soon? And if you want to, say a little bit more, please feel free to add it to the chat. All right, it looks like the responses have sort of stopped coming in. So let's do a quick summary here. It looks like the vast majority, or not the vast majority, sorry, about half of you say that your states are likely to make cuts to education funding soon. About a quarter can avoid cuts if they find new revenue, and about another quarter of states are not making cuts to education funding. And that tracks with what we're seeing across states so far. So we've got a colleague who's been, sort of tracking the action at the state level in terms of cuts to education funding. And on the whole, what that tracking shows, right now, is that most states haven't made cuts yet, right? But that doesn't mean, sort of that we've accomplished our mission here, right? Like you guys have all indicated, right? About half of states are or half of the respondents here are thinking that their states are planning to cut funding soon. So, we think that is exactly right. That is what we're worried about. That is why we're talking about this right now. We really do expect this map to start looking very differently as states head into their next legislative sessions. Really, what we've actually seen here is that CARES funding to states, up until now, has helped states avoid cuts, and some states have been able to dip into their rainy day funds to sort of help with that. And then, sort of on the individual side, other CARES benefits have prevented the massive drop off in tax revenue that we initially feared. But I think that, the concern here is that, one, as states start reimposing restrictions because of the surge in coronavirus cases, and CARES assistance expires, and, the direct aid, the stimulus funding to state and local governments that we think is really important to help states avoid funding cuts, right? That's a pretty big sticking point in negotiations around the next stimulus package. We're worried, right? We're worried that states are kind of on their own right now, and without additional intervention, like, we're going to see states take different action. So, I mean, and the point is, right, that the lessons from the last recession show us that what states do could have negative impacts for equity in school funding, and in turn, outcomes for students, particularly Black and Brown students, right? The stakes here are still very real and very high. So when states are, sort of thinking about how they might structure funding cuts, if that is what needs to happen, we know that there is no one approach that states can take, that states will take. And, frankly, school funding systems are complicated. And so an approach that accomplishes the same policy objectives in one place might look very different in practice in another state. But we do think about the ways that states can move forward here on a spectrum, where, over on the right side of this arrow, making no cuts is clearly good. And then, on the sort of left side of things, on the left side of the arrow, other methods can range from what we're calling inequitable to equal but inequitable, because, equality isn't the same thing as equity, to more equitable. So let's take a minute to look at some state-specific examples. So the first example that I like to highlight is Georgia. Leaders in Georgia decided that they needed to cut almost $1 billion from the state's core funding for K-12 education, right? So $950 million from funding for education for the 2021 school year. And folks in that state just decided that that $950 million represented about 10% of core K-12 funding. And the way that those cuts were distributed was equally across every district. So every district saw a cut of about 10%. What does this mean for funding to actual districts? So I've got two examples on the slide here. Forsyth, which is a wealthy or suburb right near DeKalb in Georgia. Forsyth has a poverty rate of 5%, so 5% of its students are living below the federal poverty level. And that 10% reduction on a per student basis was $493. In comparison, DeKalb, which has a much higher poverty rate at 22%, that 10% reduction was about $542 per student. I'll say I calculated this data myself based on some estimates that the state had released. And so, these are approximations really. But the point here, right, is that the higher need district saw a higher cut on a per student basis because the state sends a little bit more money to the higher need district, right? And here, 10% of, I'm making up numbers, right? But 10% of $1 million to the high need district is a lot more than 10% of 100,000 to a lower need district. On the other hand, we've got Ohio. So leaders in Ohio came out pretty early in the process and the timeline of things with some funding cuts. So state leaders reacted really quickly to the expected financial crisis and cut the education budget for last school year, so the 1920 school year, by $300 million. And even though they made these funding cuts, they did so in a way that took away less funding per student from districts that had lower property wealth and more students from low-income backgrounds. So specifically what that looks like is in Cleveland, which has 44% of its students living below the federal poverty line. On a per student basis, that cut was just $109 per student, I shouldn't say just. As a percentage of sort of state aid, that's just 1%. Compare that to Solon, which is a wealthy suburb right outside of Cleveland. The student poverty rate there is 7%, and the cuts to that district represented about $302 per student, right, or 38%, much larger percentage of state aid in that district. And really, what we want to see in this space is states making decisions, right? States taking action if they have to cut their education budgets, if they decide to cut their education budgets. What we're really looking for is more action like Ohio and less action like what we're seeing in Georgia. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Natasha, to talk in a little bit more detail about what this looks like in Massachusetts. On the slide a few slides ago, I don't know if you guys noticed, but Massachusetts was in green. And so, technically the state hasn't made funding cuts in the way that we tend to think about them, but that doesn't mean that the, sort of pandemic and recession haven't had consequences for school funding and for the students in Massachusetts.
Thanks, Ivy. So you actually kind of gave my introductory remarks for me. I was looking at those polling questions that came up and trying to figure out where we would put Massachusetts on that spectrum, and I found myself just being not entirely able to answer the question. So as State Director for Massachusetts, I have the privilege of supporting the work of the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, along with our Small But Mighty Massachusetts team. The Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership is a collective effort of social justice, civil rights, and education groups from across the state that came together a couple of years ago, really to push for greater attention to the disparities in opportunity and outcomes within our states. It's often thought of as sort of a leader in education, and in some ways is a leader in education. And yet underneath our sort of #1 status, there are still really big inequities in both opportunity and student outcomes. So the first year of our work really focused on this comprehensive comprehensive school funding reform law that was signed in November of 2019. It was called the Student Opportunity Act, and it was really meant to address really kind of longstanding shortages within our funding system, while also at the same time leveraging those additional resources to including some requirements in that law to make sure that those resources were used to advance opportunity and outcomes for students that most need them. So the Student Opportunity Act is the first time that we've really kind of made big changes to our school funding formula since 1993. So 26 years went by before issues within the formula that were sort of getting worse and worse and funding that was getting more and more inequitable were supposed to be addressed. The Act did a number of things that we believe are really important. One is that it promised increased funding, especially for the highest need districts. It actually committed about $1.5 billion in new investments that would be rolled out over a 7-year time frame. It also included clear requirements that districts take action to address disparities in opportunity and outcomes. So it explicitly stated that these resources are supposed to go, at least in part, to improving opportunity for students that have been underserved in our schools for too long. And thirdly, the third thing that we really pushed for throughout this whole, throughout the process as the law was making its way through our legislature, was ensuring that we leverage this opportunity to open up decision-making tables. One of the things we know is that when it comes to decisions about how resources are made, right, oftentimes those decisions are made behind closed doors. And so we really saw this as an opportunity to push for greater engagement. And we're successful in advocating for districts to have to create plans about how they were going to use these resources and engage with families and the community in making some of those decisions. So obviously the funding piece was really a big component and a driver of this work, right? That districts were supposed to get significant additional investment. And so just to give you a sense of what that's looked like, Ivy, if you can go to the next slide, be great. So this was supposed to be the first year of implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, with increases of about $300 million, more than that actually, committed and directed overwhelmingly to our highest need districts. So some of the highest need districts in Massachusetts, including places like Chelsea, Lawrence, Springfield, Worcester, were supposed to get literally millions in new dollars based on the governor's budget proposal that was released back in January, just before the pandemic. So if you are, a leader in these districts, you're expecting these resources to be part of your budget for the coming school year. And then, the pandemic obviously hit. Massachusetts was hit hard, and it was hit early. I think we're still kind of awaiting to see the full impact of the hit to our economy. In July of 2021, we saw these headlines. The state school aid was going to be level funded at 2020 level. In addition to that, districts will get federal coronavirus relief money. So level funding in our case, in a lot of ways, it is a privileged position to be in, right? Like, to say that you are not actually experiencing cuts compared to the previous year is a better position. I just want to be clear that we kind of recognize that than the place where a lot of states find themselves right now. And yet, if you think back to the previous slide and what districts were expecting to receive, what districts had been, and those are districts that frankly have been able to spend less, significantly less per student for years, right? And have been waiting for these additional resources for years. We're talking about magnitudes of about $2,000 to $3,000 in some cases per child, less than the statewide averages. These are big gaps that this new money was supposed to fill. So instead of receiving those resources, the increases we saw in those districts in the budget that came out of the conference committee, pretty sure these numbers are final. So here we see comparisons of the blue bars showing you what districts were expecting to receive, and the orange bars what they actually did receive in terms of increases over 2020 funding. So these districts are getting a little bit more money. This is mostly about inflation adjustments. But they're not going to be receiving nearly the amount of resources that they were expecting to receive this year. And that really raises this question of sort of what is a cut? You know, do we have to be below 2020 levels in order to consider ourselves sort of as having had cut funding, or is essentially deferring the promise of additional resources for another year another form of actually cutting resources to our highest need districts? We, as the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, have been engaging in some advocacy over the past few months to try to ward this off, to try to push the state to maintain its commitment. We've done that through an op-ed that was run in the Boston Globe. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So we ran an op-ed in the Boston Globe back in August, essentially to first point out that the state really does need to come through for students who've been underserved in our system for a really long time. Then writing directly to legislators this fall as they were debating the budget. You know, unfortunately, we did not see the funding increases that we were hoping to see through this bill. I'll also mention that part of the reason that this is concerning is that this also somewhat puts on hold all of the work that was supposed to be done under the Student Opportunity Act to improve opportunity and outcomes, to engage the community, right, in these conversations about how to use resources to really advance learning experiences for kids who, again, we are just not serving as well as we need to right now. So this is a delay in more than just resources. It's also a delay in some of this planning and some of these conversations, at least from the perspective of the state's ability to push for those changes. So, you know, I think as we go into next year, we're committed to staying in this fight. We will be continuing to fight for those resources and those requirements to go into effect next school year. And actually, you know, the couple of silver linings in all of this are obviously, again, maintaining flat funding from 2020 means that federal resources land on top of that instead of backfilling gaps. And moreover, having this process of planning and thinking through with the community about how we can best leverage resources to advance outcomes this coming year, hoping, keeping all fingers crossed and committing ourselves to the fight, right, means that we can talk about how do we build back better as we come back following this year of crazy interruptions.
Thanks, Natasha. So let's make all of this a little bit more concrete. We analyzed district revenue data by source to estimate the potential impacts or risks of 3 different ways that states could cut revenue to school districts. Right there, I said before, there are lots of different ways. And so, you know, while the analysis that I'm gonna highlight here is actually based on federal, you know, it's a real analysis based on federal data. You know, it doesn't account for any of the nuance of specific state funding formulas. It doesn't account for the sort of political will that exists in states to, you know, identify different sources of revenue. Our hope here really is that by presenting these data, it provides a better understanding of the risks associated with not considering equity in approaches to making funding cuts if those cuts must be made. So the tool models 3 different approaches on that inequitable to more equitable scale that I mentioned earlier. The inequitable model cuts a flat percentage of total state aid, like what we saw in Georgia. And this kind of mechanism is actually already built into some state school funding formulas to deal with general budget shortfalls, right? Like not just in times of recession. It's, it sort of seems fair on its surface, but because, like I covered earlier, states tend to send more money to high need districts. Doing this would also cut more from those districts, right? Again, 10% of $1 million to a high need district is a lot more than 10% of $100,000 to a lower need district. The next is what we call equal but inequitable. It cuts the same amount per student. This also might seem fair on the surface, but again, equal isn't equitable. Students don't have the same needs and society doesn't treat all student needs the same. So, neither should our school funding policies. There are also lots of more equitable ways that states can decide to cut funding to districts, can sort of structure their funding cuts. A more equitable approach would, sort of quote unquote, save the same amount of money. So if a state decides that they need to save 10%, then, there are a bunch of different ways that the state could save 10%, right? So in this sort of construct, a more equitable approach could save the same amount of money, but protect high need districts in the process, right? There are, lots of ways to do this. Ohio is an example. What we've modeled here is reducing funding on a sliding scale based on a district's percentage of students in poverty and the district's local revenue per student. So that districts with higher than average poverty and lower than average revenue, local revenue, would see smaller cuts than other districts. And then of course, it's worth saying again, right, that really the ideal here is no cuts and, protecting the sort of the additional investments that have been promised. Okay, so I am going to switch to the actual data tool here. And take a look at what this might mean in Connecticut. So the data visualization that we've completed here starts out by showing the breakdown of revenue by source of funds, right? So how much comes from the federal government, how much comes from the state, and how much comes from local sources. And then it shows what the total amount of a state funding cut would be if the state leaders decided to cut funding by 15%. I will flag that, we chose 15% because that seemed in line with estimates of expected budget shortfalls back when we actually did the analysis for this work. And of course, estimates are a little bit lower now. And then it shows what the differences might be across districts with different poverty rates, right? So, and it shows that for each of the three models. It presents data in terms of cuts per student. For the lowest poverty districts in the state, this is sort of the lowest poverty quintile in the state. This is the second, the third, the fourth, and then compares that, really the comparison that we're making here is what the difference is between the lowest poverty districts and the highest poverty districts, and then also what the difference is across the models, in particular with a focus on what's happening for high poverty districts. One other feature that I'll highlight for you guys is that, the charts here summarize sort of what's happening in the aggregate across districts with different levels of poverty. The tool also has a scatter plot that just sort of gives a visual picture of what this looks like for individual districts in the state, right? So what we see here is that as the percentage of students in poverty increases, the cut on a per student basis decreases across the districts. And then there's a little bit more information on sort of specifically what this means for high poverty districts, right? The inequitable model, right? So the one over here, what that looks like, what this red bar looks like compared to this red bar here. That's a difference of $1,648 per student, right? So the potential benefit to high poverty districts, the potential risk to high poverty districts here is, more than $1,600 per student. And then there's a little bit more information to help put that into additional context. Sorry, switching. Yep.
There's a few questions in the chat about.
Sure.
The first question is, is the tool public? It looks like some people want to access. And also, has this data visualization been created for every state?
Yep. Yes. So first response, no, the tool is not public yet. We are hoping to release it at the early next year. But for the folks who are like super interested right now, feel free to email us and I can provide you some state specific information. And yes, there is information for, there's data here for just about every state. There are a couple of states that we excluded from the analysis, because of data challenges, but Washington is included in the tool. Okay. So, there's no one right way to act here. We've come up with a set of principles for state action and some considerations for federal action that I'm going to just summarize pretty quickly to sort of pull all of this information together. There are three main things that we think are important to keep in mind right now. Number one, protecting education budgets, if at all possible, right? Don't cut funding at all. If that's not possible, at the very least, protect the highest need districts from cuts. And then, make sure that those same protections are applied for high need schools across or within all districts. So first, right? We think it is critical that state leaders try to protect education funding, right? It's frankly, it's barely recovered from the last recession, and in some states it hasn't recovered at all yet. And like I mentioned earlier, there are some sort of promising news here. So far, cuts haven't been as widespread as we initially feared because of CARES funding and because states were able to dip into the reserves. But as that sort of reserves fall below levels that are sort of large enough to be supplemental here, and as CARES funding dries up, and with no new stimulus package yet, states are kind of on their own. And so we think if states are going to avoid funding cuts, they are going to likely have to identify new revenue sources. Things like implementing new taxes on high wealth earners, like Arizona just did, fixing loopholes in their existing formulas, such as eliminating hold harmless policies that maintain old patterns of sending more funding to districts that no longer need it, right? Or, sort of fundamentally reforming their funding formula. And super glad that Sahava is going to be able to talk about sort of what the parameters are and variables are to consider in those kinds of processes near the end of this workshop. So next, protecting the highest need districts. If states have exhausted all other possibilities and still have to make cuts, then they should design cuts so that they protect high need districts, right? Districts with more student need, districts with lower sort of fiscal capacity, lower property wealth. right? Often it's the communities of color that have lower property wealth, that have higher poverty rates. And it's communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, right? Like state leaders really have a responsibility here and the tools to make sure that the policy solutions to deal with the pandemic and the recession aren't hurting those communities of color in particular even more. And then funding systems are complicated, right? Policy solutions sometimes have unintended consequences. And, sort of no matter what the process is, we think it's important to actually examine the impact that the cuts will have on the highest poverty districts, both in terms of total cost and on a per student basis. And, it is not enough to ensure that high poverty districts are spared from disproportionate cuts. Within district funding inequities were a problem before the pandemic, and the pandemic has only exacerbated those inequities, right? Schools serving more students with higher needs need even more support now, not less, and frankly, not the same. So we have to ensure that all districts are shielding their highest need schools from cuts in resources. And when I say resources here, I mean funding and staff and other programs or services, right? So again, avoiding first in, last out strategies for layoffs, like we saw in Los Angeles at the beginning of the last recession. I will flag that Los Angeles sort of recognized this challenge that was happening and implemented a new policy where they protected schools with, I believe it was sort of lower student performance levels from disproportionate layoffs, right? So there are things that states and districts can do here in that regard. It's also important to keep programs and efforts to ensure that students' families remain engaged, right, sort of in this time, and the students are receiving the social and emotional supports that they need. And then, reporting data is important. As soon as we started to feel the recession and recognize that state and local budgets would be in trouble, we all looked to see what lessons we could learn from the last recession, and we had varying degrees of success with that. There is so much uncertainty right now. We just need more, not less information to help deal with that uncertainty. And so the things that I'll call out here is that it's really important that states and districts continue to collect and report data, in particular, school level spending data. Rachel will talk a little bit about that in the next session. And also data on teacher layoffs, right? And here, we think it's really important to report data on layoffs, whether they actually happen, right? So like reduction in force notices, not actual reduction, or in addition to actual reductions in force. And also report that even if teachers are rehired the following year, right? There is some research that tells us that just the notices of reductions in force, even if there isn't an actual layoff, is also pretty disruptive. And so, we think it's really important to just have the data here to understand, what happened as states and districts are sort of dealing with the pandemic. And then the last point here, I don't know what the next few days of negotiations around, additional stimulus are gonna bring, but we still are advocating for Congress to step in too and provide additional state stabilization funding. With that funding, frankly, Congress can sort of require states to do all of the things that I just mentioned, right? We think that funding should come with strings, both to sort of maintain education spending, right? So protecting their budgets in total, right? In terms of the sort of total size of the pie, or as a share of all of their spending, right? And so if states were spending 30% or 20% of their budgets on education before, they should continue doing that in the future. Other strings that we think are important here are what we're calling maintenance of equity requirements. right? So shielding the highest need districts from disproportionate cuts, and also making sure that districts shield their highest need schools. And then of course, right, reporting data, like I mentioned, is critically important. That sums it up, right? At a high level, I think these are the three things that we are advocating for right now, right? Protecting education budgets, protecting highest need districts from unfair funding cuts if, sort of protecting the overall level of funding isn't possible, and requiring districts to protect their high need schools from funding and staffing cuts. So with that, I will pause for questions.
Ivy, there was a question in the chat that was missed a little earlier related to your examples on Georgia and Ohio. They wanted to know first if these are recent examples, which, yes, they are. And they want to know about how Ohio got to that point and how it made its.
Yes. Yes, great questions. Yes, Georgia and Ohio are recent examples. Georgia, the funding cuts for Georgia were for this school year, so the 2021 school year. And the funding cuts that I talked about for Ohio were for last school year, so 1920, so this recession pandemic. And then, yeah, Ohio, my understanding is that this was a push from the governor, actually, in the governor's office. And I think in general, the governor has the governor of Ohio right now has an orientation towards equity in school funding, and there had been some recent additional programs put in place, in particular to support student social and emotional and academic development needs. And I think the cuts were designed, frankly, to sort of protect those investments, right? It doesn't make sense to sort of have a policy position where you're putting additional resources into high need districts and then go and cut all of that funding away from them. And so, there's a general equity orientation, and then a specific desire to sort of make sure that those additional investments in high need districts were protected. Okay. If that is it for questions, right, Rachel, there weren't other questions in the chat that I should address?
One just came in. What do you think state governments need to learn in order for their state funding decisions to be based on inequity? They mentioned that this is a general big question.
Let's see. Yes, that is a general big question. I think that understanding the existence of the funding inequities is critically important, right? So there are, one, I'll say, lots of analyses out there that sort of identify the problem, in particular within states across districts. And then I will flag that, I think one of the issues that's been harder to see are inequities within districts across schools. And so I'm particularly excited about the school level spending data that states are now required to report on their report cards, right? I think putting out the data to identify the problem is the first step, and then sort of understanding what that means, right? What that means for differences in student experiences.
If I could jump in on this one for a second too, I think, one huge advantage with funding formulas over many other decisions that policymakers have to make in education is that they are, they're not unpredictable, right? We have the data that goes into funding formulas. We have the ability to model what will happen depending on how we shape policy. And one of the things that we absolutely have to get into the habit of doing is making sure that before any final decisions are made, decision makers run the numbers and really look at what the impacts of how they're approaching cuts and the different decisions they're making. You don't even have to understand all of the ins and outs of the funding formula, but you do have to understand the impact of what you're going to do before you do it. And I'm not sure that we always do that when trying to decide how to kind of remedy these tight budget situations.
Okay. There's a comment from Miriam in the chat that I was going to respond to, but I'll just, in the chat, I'll just respond verbally. Yes, one of the reasons we chose the maintenance of equity framing was that it aligned with the existing maintenance of effort framing that, like, you know, folks are already familiar with, that has already been incorporated into other stimulus packages. And we just sort of wanted to like align with that and, you know, sort of use that phrase to sort of tag along, I guess, with the maintenance of effort conversations. Okay. Thank you all for joining this session. Thanks for the great questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, and I think we are on track for a 10-minute break.
Okay. Sure. All right. Well, let's get things started. It's now 2:10. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richelle Presume, and today I'm going to discuss the power and potential of school funding data to be used as a tool for advocates and community members to advance spending equity. Okay. To that end, I'm hoping to discuss today 5 principles for reporting school level per student spending data that can allow this data to be presented in an equity focused way. I also want to preview the ways in which states are currently reporting their data so you all can see where there's room for improvement. And I'm really excited for us to have a discussion with Sarah Shaw today from Illinois State Board of Education, who's going to discuss the process her state took to put this information out there and how it's been valuable to community members. So I have a lot of content for you all today, and as I go through it, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure to preserve some time at the end to get to it. Okay, so as a quick refresher, when ESSA was passed in 2015, it had a fiscal transparency requirement for all states to report school level per student spending on their school report cards. That includes the total per pupil expenditure amount, including actual personnel and non-personnel expenditures for every school in the state. Okay, and this requirement went into effect in the last school year, that is the 2019-2020 school year. So for many states, this is their first time presenting these data. So why are we talking about this now? So for one, these data offer greater transparency. It offers greater access to learning about school finance, specifically for local community members. It allows us to explore the relationship between school funding and other school resources in ways we really haven't had the chance to do before. And thirdly, we've had longstanding evidence of inequities across districts. We've had research that shows that inequities across districts, specifically because they're rooted in systemic racism and historic segregation policies, school funding has persistently underserved students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And now with these data, advocates and have the opportunity to look at spending across individual schools within a district. And that's really powerful because, as Ivy discussed in her last session, school systems are grappling with the pandemic's challenges. And so now is a good time for state and district leaders and advocates to use school spending data to identify the schools and students that are being shortchanged, and to shed light where school funding decisions may compound inequities for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, and hopefully prevent that from happening. So these data can really serve as a baseline for funding conversations, whether we're advocating for more school funds or advocating against school funding cuts. But simply complying with ESSA's ESSA's fiscal transparency requirement is not enough to really inform these equity-oriented conversations. And that's a big point I want to make more concrete for you all today. So to do that, I'd like you all to take a few minutes to explore Louisiana's school spending reports. I'm going to drop a link in the chat so that you can navigate to a school page, look at the school spending report, and to try to, as you explore, answer this question about school spending equity. Is spending in this Louisiana school or district equitable? So give me a minute to get you that URL in the chat. Here. Okay, did everyone receive that link? I just sent the link in the chat. Let's take about 4 minutes for you all to explore this school report card. And as you're exploring, try to keep in mind that question about spending equity. I'll also note that Louisiana's school report is very similar to a lot of other spending reports that we've seen. They have their data on the report card, kind of in its own separate section. So just take a few minutes to explore on your own. And as you're looking at the school spending report, feel free to, put any comments or questions in the chat. Okay, let's take another minute. I'm going to put out a poll here to see if you are able to actually answer that question. Okay, I see some responses coming in. Give folks a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the polling because it looks like a good amount of responses came in. All right, and we see from the results that the vast majority of you all responded, I don't know. We don't really know if the spending at this school is equitable or if in this district it's equitable. And that's not surprising to me. You wouldn't really be able to answer that question with this report alone without a lot of, maybe switching between web pages and data mining. So that is, a big point I'm trying to make here today. So in order to really inform conversations about school funding equity, school spending data should be reported in a way that goes beyond ESSA's requirements. So, that there is nothing particularly wrong with how Louisiana put out that data, but, it may be missing some more information that would make more elements that would make this information more rich for a broader audience. And we recognize that states may need an example of what good actually looks like when it comes to this. So far, most states, 48 states to be exact, published their school level per student spending data. And we conducted a scan to see if states are reporting these data in a way that's equity oriented and actually useful for a broad audience. In order to do that scan, we leaned on 5 principles that we co-developed with the education resource strategies. And these 5 principles highlight the additional elements that states should be reporting alongside their school funding data. These principles, as I go through them one by one, I want to say up front that they're not isolated from each other. They build upon each other to create school spending reports that are complete and easy to understand, and most importantly, allow stakeholders to really assess whether differences in spending are associated with the needs of students. So at the very least, a state school spending report should answer, how much does this school spend per student? And like we saw in Louisiana, this requires a clear and total spending amount, per student spending amount that can really serve as a starting point for spending comparisons. And providing detail by the source of funds, whether it's coming from the federal sources or state and local sources, and detail by whether or not these dollars are being spent at the school site versus the district level. That just adds more transparency to the data and can answer for stakeholders questions like, where does this school or district's funding come from and where it's spent? We did find in our scan that most states are reporting a total per student spending amount with some detail about what, the source of funds, but a breakdown of whether that funding is spent at the school site or at the district level, that's seen in only about half of the states that have published their data so far. And while the per student spending dollar amounts are foundational, if these numbers are presented alone, it really makes it impossible to answer critical questions about what drives spending differences. So for example, you may see in your local school district, there's a school that's spending about $12,000 per student. But what does that actually really mean? What is actually causing that school to spend that exact amount? So those are some questions that makes, contextual information so important. Making meaning of school spending data requires some contextual information about school or district characteristics, and for this information to be reported alongside the school spending data. Because there are a number of reasons. Oops. There are a number of reasons why why some schools may spend more than others. And without context, stakeholders can make the wrong assumptions. So the primary driver we'd like to see of school spending differences is student need. Okay, the needs of students should be the primary driver, so that when we see, so that equitable, we would see that equitable school spending systems would ensure that more money is being spent where there is greater need. We know that. So for example, if a school is serving, high numbers of students with disabilities or English learner students or students from low-income backgrounds, we would like to see that those schools are receiving the additional funding necessary to provide services for students. Right? So that's why student needs should be primary driver of spending differences. But it's also very important to think about other characteristics like grade level that a school serves. For example, a high school, you may see a high school spending more than a middle school if they're putting a lot of money towards instructional materials for college prep courses. School size is also a factor. With smaller schools, less student enrollment, but they might have the same fixed cost as a school with more students. The school size is a factor. We'd also, expect to see spending differences between alternative schools with, very specialized programs and traditional schools. And performance can also come into play. For example, if a school is identified for comprehensive support, they could be receiving school turnaround funds. So these are all just some examples of, what could really be driving school spending. Unfortunately, in our scan, we found that, there aren't a lot of states that are reporting the contextual elements we're looking for, that allow stakeholders to interpret differences in spending. But luckily, New York can serve as a good example. In this screenshot here, you can see that New York's report, their school funding report, has some contextual information about the district related to student need and their, local funding, ability to raise local funds. We also see student demographic information for the individual school, as well as for the district. And this is located right on their school funding report. So it makes a very clear connection between these factors and the dollar amounts that we see that a school is spending. And since per student spending varies from school to school, another common question that stakeholders may have is, how does this school spending compare to other schools? We found that the most popular comparisons reported by states were comparisons that allow stakeholders to understand how a particular school's funding compares to the average, school spending compared to the average state or district level per student spending. So those are the most popular comparisons we see. And, state and district average per student spending are helpful reference points, for us to understand, if a school's funding is below or around average. But really assessing whether spending at a school is equitable requires comparisons to other schools across the district or state. And we found that to be pretty rare in the state reports that are out now. So Illinois is actually one of 14 states that reports per student spending for all schools in a particular district. And so I'm going to preview for you Illinois' report card so that you all can see that the way comparisons are presented, how that can make a world of difference in how stakeholders are able to engage with that information. Oops. Okay, do you all see, this is Illinois' report card. Okay, and right now we're looking at Abraham Lincoln Middle School's school spending report. This report has the total per student spending for the school, along with the average spending across the district, which is Rockford, Illinois. And when we hover over, we get some really interesting contextual information around enrollment and around student demographics, like students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, students with IEPs. And that just gives us a sense of the student need in the school and the district. So this is one comparison, but it doesn't stop there for Illinois' report. We're also able to see school spending across the district for all schools. So we see this individual school and how it compares to other schools. And we see from this example that most of the schools in this district are hovering around the district average, with one exception. And when we hover over here, we see that it's a uniquely small school, likely with a specialized program. So it's a bit of an outlier. What's really great about Illinois' report card is that they also allow districts to put in commentary to really explain the variations that we see in the school, like in the numbers that are really presented here. They have more meaning with these descriptions. So that is a really great feature. But what can really offer a deeper perspective on spending differences is spending based on spending across schools based on school or student characteristics. So, for example, you can look at this report and see spending compared to across schools based on their performance summative designation. So their performance for their school as a whole. And while spending is not solely responsible for performance outcomes, yeah, this is a very helpful relationship to explore, just so that you can get a sense of maybe district priorities around spending and to ask questions, and also to identify schools that are doing well or that are having high performance. And you could look at their student need, and you could potentially ask questions about how they're achieving those high outcomes for their students. But it's also, like we said, student needs should be the driver of school spending when it comes to equity. So we want to look at spending across schools based on student characteristics as well, right? And so this is an example of spending across schools that serve different percentages of English learner students. We see where the school falls in the distribution. And we see that with this example, there's not a lot of differentiation between a school that's serving no English learners compared to a school that's serving about majority English learners. So that's something that you might want to ask questions about. You can also look at comparisons based on students with IEPs and based on percentage of students from low-income backgrounds. And we see that spending patterns is relatively flat here too in this example. What really sets Illinois' report card apart from other states that we've seen is just how they've managed to couple that contextual information with their comparisons. And that really offers a comprehensive experience and understanding for stakeholders. Great. Okay, so comparisons like those presented in Illinois' report card really allows advocates to see spending patterns, and these spending patterns can serve as a starting point to conversations, to identifying inequities, and to push district leaders and state leaders and to make funding fairer. And because school funding matters, it's one of several resources that impact the student experience. We know that the outcomes we want to see for our students take strategic investment. And therefore, when you see different spending patterns, when you're looking at comparisons, it should incite different questions. And equity advocates have done a lot of great work to call out the injustice of spending patterns that favor low-need districts or schools. For example, if we see that more state and local dollars, more money is being spent at schools that serve a wealthier student population, for example, we know that's inequitable. But what happens if we see spending patterns similar to what the example we just saw in Illinois? Right? If we're seeing flat spending patterns, we know that equal is not equitable. Okay, because student needs varies. And research shows that students from low-income backgrounds, English learner students, and students with disabilities require more resources to meet their student their learning needs. And in some cases, you may see comparisons, and you might see that there's slightly more funding being spent in schools that serve, that have higher need. You might see slightly progressive spending patterns, as some may call it, right? And that doesn't mean as advocates that our job is necessarily done. There's still some questions that could be asked there. The next question naturally should be how much more is being spent in the schools that have higher need, because research also shows that not only do students from low-income backgrounds, English learners, and students with disabilities require more funds, they require substantially more funds. For example, there are studies that show that English learners would require about 1.5 times as much funding as a non-English learner student, and that students from low-income backgrounds need at least 2 times as much funding than a wealthier student to meet their learning needs. So there are definitely still questions to be asked. And when we look at comparisons, you may not have all the answers to your questions, all the answers from your questions, but this should definitely provide the information needed to enter conversations around school spending equity. So comparisons are very helpful for that. Okay, and that leads me to the next point here about how well. Our next principle is really just about helping stakeholders to make the connection between school spending and other non-financial resources that create high learning experiences for all students. And the simplest way for states to do that is to report their data on the report card, because it makes the data just easier to find, makes it easier to translate also, and it creates a one-stop shop for stakeholders who want to learn about their school's resources. Washington does this, like most states, but not all states have their data on the report card. So far, we see that there are 10 states that don't have per student spending data on the report card, even though it's required by ESSA. And our last principle is about accessibility, and it's pretty straightforward. School spending reports should not be difficult to understand, and making reports clear with visualizations just make it easier for stakeholders to engage with that information. The DC does a really good job of this. DC has visualizations that are, jargon free. It's easily accessible on the report card, and yeah, it's just a very clean presentation. So we'd like to see states making their data accessible. Oops. Oh. Excuse me, I'm going to reshare my screen. Wait, no. Give me 1 minute. Oh, technology. Okay, is my screen visible? Great.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so the principles that I just previewed for you, they're all intended to help stakeholders like yourselves, advocates, have the information they need to answer their fundamental questions about school spending, and to have conversations about school spending equity. In order to have these conversations and have that information, you can put all these principles together to allow reports to do just that. Okay, and unfortunately, what we've seen in the scan is that most states, while they are reporting a total per student spending amount, they have detail by source, and most states have their data on the report card, which is all required by ESSA. States are really falling short of making this, reporting this data with context and comparisons and elements that really make the data actionable for stakeholders. So Illinois actually is the only state we found that has a really equity-oriented report. So I'm really excited for us to jump into our conversation with Sarah to really discuss their process. And so when states, have the opportunity to improve their school spending reports, they can. With that being said, I'm going to introduce Sarah Shaw. Sarah Shaw serves as the Senior Manager of Fiscal and Academic Solvency at the Illinois State Board of Education. And in that role, she builds bridges between programs and finance so the state K-12 policy and practice supports schools more holistically. And before coming to Illinois State Board of Education, Sarah directed education policy for the Illinois Secretary of Education during the state's successful transition, the state's successful K-12 funding formula reform effort. So I'm going to kick things off with a few questions, and I'll try to preserve some time at the end to get 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Okay, so actually I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Have this conversation. Okay. Hi, Sarah. You played a really large role in planning and releasing Illinois' school spending data. So can you talk to us about the goals you wanted to achieve and why they were prioritized in your state?
Yeah, first of all, it's a pleasure to get to be here with this group today. I was listening into the first session and thinking just how timely it is, and excited to speak to particularly why this school spending requirement became so important for the Illinois work and why it mattered to us to do it well. So whenever there's a new requirement, there's an opportunity to either do it for compliance or do it for value. And we saw a real chance with the school spending requirement in ESSA to make it something valuable. And so the beginning of our process was to bring together an advisory group made up of the people who were going to be responsible for the data, both responsible for answering questions about it and the people who had the most opportunity to change it. That if this was going to be a data set that would reveal inequities, we needed the people who were in the driver's seat causing whatever decisions were to be made to be invested in seeing the data themselves and using them. So that advisory group was superintendents, school business officials, representatives from statewide professional organizations and advocacy groups sitting together and starting with the question of what would make this data valuable to us. And a lot of it is what we already went over in this session about kind of financial transparency, being able to assess and improve equity, thinking about the relationship and exploring the relationship between financial investments and student outcomes, and starting conversations around best practices and innovations. This was a brand new reporting requirement for Illinois, as it was for many states, and we knew we had a lot to learn. So that value proposition guided everything we did from there on out. If we were deciding how to put the data up on the report card, we went back to what is it that we're trying to accomplish. If we were deciding what role the state would have specifically, we went back to that value proposition, because in it was contained that this was really about the relationship between local districts and their communities. And the state had an important role to play in highlighting that, but it was going to be a dialogue. There was a limit to what the state could draw conclusions about, and it was much more, I think, Rachel, you already pointed to this, about conversations and inviting people into dialogue with each other. The other thing that was a goal of ours as we implemented this reporting requirement was that ownership of district leaders themselves of the data. A lot of times we think of spending decisions as something passive. A budget from last year gets tweaked for this year, and it's just kind of like, okay, moving on. And highlighting that district leaders and school boards have this financial responsibility and opportunity to make decisions about where their dollars will go. And to do that, we also needed to recognize where our district leaders were starting. So a new reporting requirement like this is a significant lift. And instead of framing it as a gotcha, oh, let's see exactly how much inequity there is, we started with what supports can the state offer. And we wanted to, of course, ensure that we were complying with the law, and we wanted to hew close to our value proposition. But that's where we ended for year one, of just what's that minimum amount of data that by putting it up on our state's report card, we will be getting at these really important conversations, but we won't be making it a more onerous requirement than it needs to be. Leaves the door open for future improvements, but really focuses from the get-go on what can make these data valuable and how do we support districts in getting to that, not kind of like the whole kettle of fish all at once. So those were our goals and our basic approach. And I think Illinois was well positioned to do the work and to prioritize it for a few different reasons. We had tremendous support from both state superintendents. While this initiative was in progress, we had a transition in leadership, and both really saw that the equity potential here. Number two, we had, as a state, just gone through state funding formula reform, to the previous session's point, and I believe the next session as well. And so education finance was already in the air. We had just had a huge statewide discussion around the equity between districts in school funding, and this now is a kind of natural entree into, let's talk about the equity between districts. The equity within districts. So moving from what the state has power over to what a district has power over. And because of our funding formula reform, more dollars were going to districts, which just made it a little more amenable to talk about scrutiny of where those dollars were going. The final, I think, major condition for prioritization here was we were really lucky to be part of a national network that was thinking about how to do this well. I think it's rare that major state level initiatives get to take advantage of so much collaboration among other states and have that dedicated thought partnership space set aside. And both the Department of Education, the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University, and other states coming together really created that space and allowed this to be something we could put at the forefront.
That's really helpful to know, why this was prioritized and what prompted, your state to really, put this data out in such an intentional way. Oh, Sarah, did we lose you?
So I'm still on the phone. As one always hopes will happen, something messed up with the actual webcam. So I can still hear you and happy to keep talking, and we'll meanwhile work on getting my webcam back up.
All right, great, sounds good. All right, so can you talk to us about how the spending reports were received by districts and local stakeholders in your state, and how Illinois State Board of Education plans to use that feedback for improvement going forward?
Yeah, so that initial stakeholder group of about 26 school business officials, superintendents, statewide representatives, when it came time to actually think about how these data would get used, we also expanded the group to include principals, teachers, advocates, parents, people who could talk to us about what this might look like on the ground and how it could get used. And they were part of what really led to some of the visualizations that we looked at earlier in saying, well, if we want to talk about equity, we need to have student demographics side by side. And if we want to talk about the relationship between student investments and student outcomes, we definitely need student outcomes visualized in some way. And if we want to focus on the spending within a district, then that's what our comparison should prioritize. We still have comparisons available to other districts in the state or other schools in other districts in the state, but the priority was really looking at that between district spending, between school spending within the same district. So that drove our first year. And then year two, we came back to that same expanded group after having learned from the field, seen how some of these data were getting used, and asked, what can we do? What can we do that we should keep the same because it's working? What should we do to change because we have the opportunity for continuous improvement here? And first answer was to keep most of the initiatives stable, which is sometimes rare in statewide initiatives, that a thing gets to stay the same for multiple years over time. But we thought we had gotten a promising enough start, and it was worth it to us to make it something really understood by the field and owned by the field rather than the state switching it up every year. The one major improvement that we did add in this year was that we just released our second year of data, and we now had 2 years to put side by side. And we worked with our advisory group again on what should those multiple years of spending look like next to each other, highlighting that this isn't a data point that you just look at one moment in time, but it's really reflecting a decision-making process and can be inquired about as such. Okay, none of us knew what the data were going to look like in year one, but then we looked at the data for year one and how is that influencing how a district chooses to allocate its resources for years 3, 4, 5, and out.
I think that's a really great segue to get at, which you started to talk about a little bit. What is the role that states can play in really supporting that district's strategic school spending decisions?
I think different states have quite different answers to this. And in our mind, it's been walking the line between being inactive, taking an inactive role, versus taking a kind of an overly activist role. An example of the inactive role here might be just slapping the data up on a PDF without any context in a way that certainly complies with the ESSA requirement, but doesn't actually position the data to be used. The overly activist side of things might have been to include a lot of state commentary and value judgments on what was coming out, or to use these data to then say, all right, we know exactly how every district in the state should be spending its money, despite the fact that we have hundreds of districts with hugely diverse student populations and local priorities. And the state isn't the one being held accountable to how students are doing in any specific district. So we were looking for how do we walk that line between, certainly not abdicating the role that we have, but also not honoring where the decisions were actually getting made. And so for Illinois, that was prioritizing financial transparency and making sure that anyone who might want to use these data could have it at their fingertips. And number two, really going back to thinking about dialogues. What are the data and how we present them in a way that will prompt questions that make these data meaningful? And as a further support to that, we also put out some supporting resources, 2-pagers that explain what are these data, where do they come from, what might drive some differences in spending between schools, and templates that district leaders could use with their cabinets or with their school leaders or teachers to help orient anyone who has a stake in these data as to what they are and where they come from and how they might be used.
All right, that is so great. You have the data presented well, you have these resources, they're out there. So for my last question before I open it up to some questions from the participants, how do you hope districts and communities are actually using these resources in this data? How do you hope they are using it, especially now amid the pandemic and the financial uncertainty?
When times of financial uncertainty come along, districts have a lot of decisions to make, and they're really tough decisions. And we hope these data inform them. They're an autopsy in the sense of it's where the money went the previous year, but what an opportunity to look at how are our priorities reflected in those decisions and how do we want them to be reflected in the future. And so these school by school spending data get down to the granular level of what is the student experience in a way that we haven't been able to see before. As part of a broader push towards strategic resource allocation that we hope every district is employing and that we as a state are committed to. So I talked about the state's role in the school by school spending data. We've expanded that to talk about what's the state's role in strategic resource allocation as a whole. Our board just published a strategic plan for the full agency, and there's an entire priority area dedicated to this strategic resource allocation piece where we say the state's job is to support the decision makers. We aren't necessarily those decision makers, but we have a role to play in encouraging collaboration between the program side of a district and the finance side of the district, which historically are not always in tight communication. We have a role to play in putting data forward, and we have a role to play in maximizing the equity of the resources that we provide to districts in the first place.
Great. Well, we have, first of all, you have a shout out in the chat. It says, thank you for bringing this information and providing the hard truth about implementation. But there's also a really good question in here too. There's a question about the politics around this. Advocates may encounter resistance from their states if they're afraid of highlighting how they're falling short of revealing that spending practices are not equitable. Does Sarah have any advice for advocates on how to push for that transparency, even if it might reveal something that isn't pretty? Great question.
it is a good question. I have a two-pronged answer in terms of what served us well in Illinois. I am back in the Zoom now, by the way. Video still isn't working, but I can at least see things starting to come in. I think the first part of my answer is emphasizing that these are just the first years of seeing these data. And we can all have some grace with that. In terms of districts are, in many cases, going to be looking at it for the first time and can say as such. We've had districts use that narrative, that optional narrative, to say, this is our first year or this is our second year of looking at the data, and here's what we're hoping to do with it. And then the accountability is kind of on, well, are you doing that in the future, as opposed to atoning for the sins of the past that you weren't even aware of. And it creates it frames it as a learning opportunity more than a gotcha. So that's one. It's kind of leaning into the fact that this is the first time and opening up that learning space. The second is there's no way that our visualizations would have gone as far as they did had we not been working directly with the people who were going to be held accountable for them. And I think any advocate push really benefits from being paired with relationships and collaboration with the statewide professional organizations and with representatives from superintendents and school business officials. Not as a way to try to water it down and only show what you're comfortable showing. That's not it at all. And the law pretty much prevents that. But rather, how do we do this in a way that it feels like a fair representation and that it's something that will be useful to you. Those scatter plots that we showed, if you had told me at the beginning of this process that we would get to a point where our advisory group of largely the people who are holding the buck at the end of this would be interested in those scatter plots, I would have said that was kind of pie in the sky dreaming. And instead, by the time we got to that point in the process, they were invested in seeing how does my spending line up with where my students are, because this is now actionable information for me as a district leader.
Great, excellent. I think that's a really great point to end on, unless there's any other pressing questions for Sarah in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspective and talking about all the great work that you've done in Illinois. And I really hope that this serves as an example for other states in their efforts going forward and in their improvement.
Thank you so much. It's been just a pleasure and an honor, and the work of the Education Trust highlights these data in a way that we hope they continue getting used across the country.
Great, thank you. Okay, and on that note, I want to, reiterate that we need greater transparency now, as Ivy said in her session. Greater transparency around school spending is needed now, especially how it may impact students' access to resources in a landscape with remote learning and pandemic uncertainty. And so it's important that states improve their school spending reports so that a broader range of stakeholders are able to engage in these pressing conversations around school spending and equity. And one way that states can really do that is adopt these 5 principles that I discussed today. So thank you all for joining us. I'll hear if there's any questions.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, Rachel. One is about what states need in order to design better funding report cards. Are there any additional supports, like examples or funding or human capital, that states need in order to design better funding report cards?
Mm-hmm. Great, that is a really great question. First, I'll start by saying that, this is, for Atlantic States, the first year they're putting this out. They put in investment and effort to put the data out as they are right now. And what we saw in the scan is that it may just be a few small tweaks or additional features that really can make a world of difference. So it is worth, that additional, investment and effort. What they could use, we could learn from Illinois' process and example. is having, I'd say the human capital piece, having a diverse range of stakeholders, that is people who are putting out the information, but also the end users, the people who have to, who are looking for this information to, be brought to the table, and how how their school reports are designed and published, right? So I think that is a big piece for states. And what additional supports? I think, looking across at other states, like, bright spots, and how other states have reported their spending data is also a really helpful practice to improve, design better report cards.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think like that is all right. I think one of the primary messages that I hope you guys sort of take away from this is that before we even get there, right, it is a requirement to make sure that states think that this is a priority, right? Like that they actually prioritize this before you sort of even get into figuring out what additional support states would need to design better report cards. They have to want to design better report cards. And I hope that's sort of what we're conveying here.
Mm-hmm.
We have one final question in the chat, and I know we're at time, so we'll keep this quick, but even with greater transparency, does that necessarily create equity? There was an example of charters in one state having leeway to fundraise outside the school funding formula to get more money, which, regardless of transparency rules, means that some schools have access to additional funding and some schools don't.
Mm-hmm. That is a really great point. And yeah, I think you're right. This transparency may not show any like private funds that are raised at the district level. But I think it's still very important for the data to be published, just so that we know what that baseline is in schools spending. And I think when you have transparency, it does create a different, more scrutiny and hopefully more pressure from equity advocates and families to really ask that question and, to dig into like where other inequities may like reveal themselves. So I don't know if that's a very satisfying response, but I think this is definitely a foundation to revealing inequities. And we hope that there's more work going forward. Okay, see some comments coming through. Is there any other questions?
I think that we are good to pause on questions for now and move to break.
Okay.
We're getting to the break just a few minutes late, so I'm just going to update our plan that instead of reconvening at 3:05, we'll reconvene at 3:08, and we look forward to seeing you then. Hello, everyone. This is Zahava Stadler from EdTrust. Thanks for sticking with us through a long but hopefully enlightening afternoon. I'm going to get started with our third session on building a better school funding formula. So here we go. We've been talking about school funding in challenging times, what it means for states to make cuts to school funding and transparency measures that can help us understand how districts are making decisions about the use of scarce resources. I want to think now to the years ahead and making sure that our school funding policies are strong over the long term. So here's my agenda for this conversation. First, why focus on school funding formulas? Why is this an important policy focus right now? Number two, funding formulas in brief. Just a little bit about what we mean when we say funding formulas. What is it that we're talking about? Number three is an interview, notes from the field. We're going to have a conversation with John Hartchuck from Texas 2036 about that state's recent funding reform. And then I'm going to talk about Common Sense and Fairness, which is a report and tool that can help advocates and policymakers think through the process of reforming a school funding formula. There'll be time at the end for questions, but as with the previous sessions, please feel free to enter questions as they come up in the chat. If it's something that's immediate and pressing, we'll address it in the moment. Otherwise, we'll collect those questions and answer them when the time comes. So, why focus on school funding formulas? What I have here is some genuine challenges that have been reported about schools in these states over the past few years. In Delaware, we have a situation where there are not enough school counselors. 18,000 students in Delaware have no counselor access at all in their schools, and only 1 in 5 kids are enrolled in a school with enough counselors. In Colorado, we've had a number of news stories about how suburban districts around Denver are struggling to support appropriately an increasingly high poverty population. They're casting about as they try to hire family liaisons and paraprofessionals to provide the additional supports that these students can benefit from. In Oklahoma, we've had several years of stories about teachers leaving the state for better paying positions in Texas school districts. They're being recruited away by Texas school districts close to the Oklahoma border. And in Idaho, we've recently had school reporting about schools having difficulty serving rising numbers of special education students. These and similar problems plague schools around the country, but these are not just narrow problems where the answer is hire more counselors or change your teacher contracts or you've got a problem with changing student demographics that you need to adjust to. These are not individual problems. All of these problems connect directly to weaknesses in their state school funding systems. For instance, Delaware has a very rigid school funding system that means that staff money has to be spent in specified ways. Districts have no flexibility to prioritize counselors specifically for the populations they serve. In Colorado, the school funding formula is heavily biased towards small and rural districts. So money for small districts eats up a huge slice of the education funding pie, leaving less money to support high need students. And that leaves behind big cities and large suburbs that have increasingly disadvantaged populations. In Oklahoma, the school funding formula doesn't allocate very much state money per student, and districts are actually barred from raising extra funds locally. So with no release valve, districts can't do much to offer incentives to teachers who see better opportunities just over the state line. And finally, in Idaho, there actually is funding for special education in the Idaho state funding system, but it's not based on the actual numbers of special education students in the district. Instead, there's a general assumption that a certain percent of kids will have special education needs, and that's how the state funds districts. So if a district suddenly sees a jump in special education enrollment, it doesn't get any additional support to provide for those students. And all of these challenges are pre-COVID. So imagine how much more pressing some of these problems are now. In other words, funding matters, not just how much, but how the policy that a state uses to hand out its funding, and to determine the state and local dollars that are supposed to be in each school system and for what purpose, all of that matters, not just in principle, but for the real concrete educational experiences that students are having on the ground. So that's me making the case for why you should care about school funding formulas. Lots of advocacy in the realm of education funding focuses on how much, the appropriations, trying to get the state to invest more money overall in education. And that is really important. But lots of education challenges are related not just to the amount of money, but also to the policy specifics on how that money is handed out and what can be done with it. In other words, the state funding formula. So I'm hoping that I've sold you a bit on the importance of state funding formulas. So my ultimate goal at the end of this session is to introduce a new tool that can help advocates and policymakers think through the best funding formula options. But before we get into those weeds, here's a Formula 101 just to cover some of the fundamentals. Every state has a funding formula, and the structure is written into state statute. So this is a matter for the legislature. And generally speaking, these formulas have 3 big steps. Step 1, the state uses a formula to determine how much money the district needs for the year. It sets a target amount, the formula amount for each school district. Step 2, the state calculates how much funding the district is expected to reasonably kick in from local sources. The state will almost always have a way of determining how much money the local district can reasonably be expected to raise and provide on its own, as opposed to what it needs from the state. And therefore, step 3, once the state calculates the amount that should be raised from an expected local contribution, it backfills the rest of the formula amount as state aid. So these are extremely broad strokes, but how is that target amount determined in step 1? How does the state judge what local contribution is reasonable to expect from districts in step 2? And therefore, how can it know how much state money to provide in step 3? All of the policy work happens in determining the details of these steps. So there are lots of nuances to how each state arrives at a total target number. And this is where a lot of the policy energy goes. What should be a part of that calculation? Considerations that drive the calculation of that target amount are questions like, first, the basic question, before accounting for any particulars, just in general, how much funding is needed per student? Second, how should the funding system account for students with specific needs? So when Idaho decided to design a special education funding mechanism that just set a general assumption, hey, every school district is going to have 6% of their students with special education needs, and that's the assumption we're going to make, they simplified things a little. Right? There was no need to report actual numbers of students with disabilities in order to get funding. There was no need to tailor different funding amounts to different levels of student need based on their disability. But that decision to prioritize simplicity, that had consequences for accuracy and precision. Districts with fewer special education students might be getting more money than they need. Districts that provide special education services to more students might face big shortfalls. So districts, the decisions that the state makes about how to account for students with specific needs matter quite a lot, and all of that fine print is decided in the formula and in the legislature. Similarly, number 3, how should the state answer similar questions about how the funding system should account for differences in local conditions? So a rural district, for instance, might face very different transportation challenges than an urban district with cost consequences. All of these decisions have to be made in the legislature, and all of these decisions come together and add up to that target amount for each district. How tall is that dollar bill? And then there's a separate set of policy questions for calculating a local share. How much of that target is going to be the responsibility of the local district rather than the state? The point of this exercise is that not every district has the same ability to raise local dollars for education. So if the state didn't consider that and just funded, say, half of the target automatically, some districts would struggle to make up that other half. Some districts would easily be able to cover that other half and then some. So how does the state do that? Usually the way this works is that the state looks at property taxes. So the state will set an expected local property tax, say 1%. And that same rate will raise more money in property wealthy school districts and less money in property poor ones. And so the amount that would be raised by that rate in that district is factored into the equation. This is usually called equalization. And there are lots of other considerations states could have. Everything else on this list is something that you see in some state policies, but they're less common. The core of local revenue for schools is property tax dollars, and that is therefore the focus of most local share policies. So the state has lots of decisions to make in deciding not only how much money a district needs, but also how much of that target should be covered by the local district versus by the state. So putting it all together, all of these questions and considerations mean that the money that a district receives at the end of the day is the product of a lot of moving parts. So for instance, if the district whose funding is shown here sees an increase in their student need, let's say there's a big influx of English language learners, their formula amount will probably go up, and so will their state aid. But then think if that same district sees a big rise in local home values, their area becomes a lot more desirable. And so with that big increase in property values, the district could be expected to cover more of their formula amount locally out of property tax dollars. And they'll now get less state aid, even with the increase in the target amount. So all of these moving parts come together. Every individual component matters, and every component will have its own interested constituencies and inspire its own policy debates. Anytime a state is going to take this on, every little piece of this Rube Goldberg machine is going to have its own people arguing for and against it. Everybody's going to have its own driving force. So in light of that, I want to ground this conversation in some real world experience with the politics and practicalities of changing a state funding formula. So we're now going to have a discussion with John Hartsock, who is the Vice President of Policy for Texas 2036, which is a data-driven, nonpartisan think tank and advocacy organization led by former Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings that seeks to ensure that Texas remains the best place to live, work, and raise a family. That's what he said, the best place to live and work and raise a family as Texas approaches its bicentennial. Prior to joining Texas 2036, John served as Deputy Director of Budget and Policy for Governor Greg Abbott. John's work in the governor's office culminated in the passage of House Bill 3, which overhauled the education funding system in Texas. So I'm going to ask John a few questions, and then hopefully we should have time for a couple of audience questions at the end. So if you have questions for John as we speak, please put them in the chat. I'm going to stop the screen share now so that you can see both John and myself and we can have a conversation. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So you've been through the wars here. The funding reform in Texas has already come about, and I think is generally regarded as a success. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about how this all started. How did people know that a reform was called for, necessary? What were the things people used to complain about in the old Texas school funding formula?
Well, the old Texas school funding formula, I think old is the operative word there. It had remained virtually unchanged since the early 1980s, with the exception of a few tweaks that had to be made on property taxes to respond to Supreme Court mandates. But there were people out there complaining about four main different topics. It was either not enough money and who got it, the equity problems, cuts associated with the Great Recession. There were issues, as you mentioned, with property taxes and the redistribution of those. We call that recapture in Texas when we move it from one district to another. But property taxes were going up 8% per year for many districts, and that compounds over time. There were a lot of perverse incentives that kind of got built into the formula over time as they just kind of band-aided over problems, over 30, 40 years of responding to Texas Supreme Court saying, oh, that's not constitutional. Okay, let's come back and tweak something. And lastly, I think at a certain point, people were frustrated with the outcomes we were achieving with our education system. This $60 billion enterprise we call the Texas K-12 system just wasn't leading to what people thought was good taxpayer value.
Well, it sounds like there was a really strong imperative for reform, but interestingly, Texas didn't start this reform in the legislature. You'll often see a big complicated policy in a state. It starts with some discussion and then somebody proposes a bill and then that bill goes to committee and there's a whole lot of markup and a lot of debate. But that's actually not where the process began in Texas for this particular reform. There was a school funding commission that hashed through these issues the year before the legislative process. So why was a school funding commission necessary? Could this have just gone through the regular legislative process? What did the commission add to the conversation?
Well, I think the commission was really absolutely necessary to get something this big and this agreed upon, because frankly, it wasn't that the legislature hadn't tried. The legislature had tried and failed, and then tried and failed again. And then, we had a special session and still couldn't get anything through. But what happened with the commission was basically the problems were too big to solve with these kind of like isolated solve for symptoms rather than solving for the whole disease of the thing. You made a great allusion earlier to the Rube Goldberg machines, and that's really what the problem was. Is if you kind of pulled out one thing and tried to solve for this one problem, it would cause the entire system to collapse on another side. So nobody could come to an agreement around A, what you were trying to solve for, but B, like how you could solve for that problem without causing massive negative effects for another population. So what the commission allowed us to do was orient around a few key issues and then collaboratively work to solve those with ideas from across the political spectrum. So that's how you end up with things like merit-based teacher pay alongside supplemental funding for students experiencing poverty, how you get things like bilingual education and tax cuts. There's something in there for everyone, but we were able to take the time to peel back that onion and build a formula where everyone gets what they're looking for, but the math works. And you had to start, frankly, from building from scratch, from the bottom up, to get everything there. And we, with the $60 billion enterprise, that takes some time and some meetings.
Well, the commission did come out with its recommendations, and then in some states, a commission comes out with funding recommendations and then they go nowhere. That occasionally does happen. Funding reform is always a contentious issue, but this was actually a big bipartisan legislative achievement. So what actually brought that about from either an outside advocacy perspective or an inside legislative perspective? How was this actually brought to fruition with such a big bipartisan level of support?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with how the commission was structured. It was really made to have kind of lower stakes consensus building with plenty of a runway. It had a full year to work, and it started work at the beginning of 2018, and it didn't wrap up until a couple days before Christmas. So within that, it was also structured to succeed from a membership perspective. So you had 3 members of the House of Representatives, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. There was rural, suburban, urban. 3 senators, Republicans and Democrats from different parts of the state. You had 3 educators, both a superintendent, a CFO, and a school teacher. And then you had civic leaders, and this was kind of a unique thing. One of the civic leaders was the chair, former Supreme Court justice, who was part of the courts that had been striking things down and saying, this isn't working. So one of the things that was kind of fun about that was, with the chair being a Supreme Court justice, he ran it a lot more like a court than you would think these commissions typically are. Like, if this was not a legislatively led thing, this was a gentleman who wanted to come in seeking a unanimous decision from all of his disparate entities from the outset. So, he came in and had well-organized hearings on themes to orient people towards solving for a single goal. He's like, the goal of an education system should be to have students that graduate ready for what comes after the K-12 system. Are they ready for college? Are they ready for career? We can't lose sight of the student outcomes, and we need to build back from what is it going to take, and then we'll figure out how to pay for it. But you can't figure out how to pay for it if you don't know how you're gonna, or where you want to be. And I would say one other part of this was, it was kind of the perfect alignment of political leadership, business leadership, and education leadership. But there are also a lot of people out there like yourself who are willing to volunteer your time and come down and help us out. And I know a lot of people really appreciated your input in the Texas School Finance Commission work. So just wanted to say thank you for that.
Well, Austin's always a fun place to visit, and I was happy to butt in and offer my thoughts. And I think, that's often how these processes go, is that everybody's got some thoughts, and this is true of lots of different constituencies on the ground, and there are interest groups that are focused on particular elements of any funding reform that they're hoping to see. But some of the most discussed aspects of HB3, the reform that had passed, different people's pet projects that often get pointed to after the fact, some of them are not actually things that determine a huge slice of the education funding pie. So for instance, the teacher incentive allotment was a big political win in some ways, and there are a lot of people who are very proud of the outcome and looking forward to seeing the upshot of that program, but it doesn't drive huge numbers of dollars relative to the overall reform. So what are some unsung parts of the new law that have had or will have a really big impact?
Well, fundamentally, we reshaped the entire formula when we were doing this ground up, so that the formula in of itself was focused on the needs of an individual student and that student's background, and less on the random geography of district lines, which is, the 1940 system that we had inherited. But then within that, there was a goal to have it not just funded based off of the student's individual need, but oriented around that goal of graduating the student with the outcomes that the state desired. So there are a lot of things that were built in strategically, so that you're not going to force the district to go off and do this, but merit-based teacher pay, the teacher incentive allotment, only a couple $100 million at the outset, but can have a fundamental impact on overhauling the system. Likewise, there are some outcomes bonuses in there. There's funding for dual language programs that we're really proud of in Texas, growing that and the impact that's having. And we had people from San Antonio come up and talk about how dual language programs were having a larger impact on voluntary desegregation of public schools than anything else. Let's take that statewide. And everyone goes, yes, please. And then early childhood funding, and something that to me it was really prescient now that we're dealing with COVID, is funding for the rethinking of the school year, and a program that allows us to add additional days over the summer, so that students experiencing poverty can have that extended opportunity to learn and now in the COVID world, perhaps catch up from learning loss that's unfortunately occurring.
Well, we had a couple of questions come in, John, specifically for you. So before I let you go, I'd like to, first of all, we had a question about the commission process. So you had mentioned the role of the commission chair in this particular case affecting the dynamic. There's a question about who's the best convener of a school funding commission, and what should be the actual scope of work for any school funding commission in terms of this?
Well, I think it takes buy-in. So the legislature passed a bill that created this and gave appointment powers to both the speaker, the lieutenant governor, and the governor. The lieutenant governor in Texas is the president of the Senate. So every chamber, the executive branch, everyone had buy-in on this from the outset. So once the ante was in and the skin was in the game, then there was everyone stayed engaged throughout the entire process. Including the business community. And I think that's where a lot of the education groups, I got to give a special shout out to the folks at the Commit Partnership, who really, there is a gentleman named Todd Williams who was on the commission, who worked to make sure that the business community never passed up the opportunity to stay engaged and make sure that legislators were hearing. Because obviously the education community was engaged at every step along the way. But it was kind of having the buy-in of every stakeholder, realizing this was a unique opportunity to really change things. And there were a lot of moments where people were very skeptical. I remember walking into rooms of superintendents and going, yeah, we've heard this before. This isn't going to happen. And then suddenly, March rolls around, April rolls around, people are like, oh, wow, this might actually happen. And before you know it, an 80-year-old system has been completely changed.
The final question we have for you is about the sausage making of it and some of the compromises that were necessary. And this person's pointing out that on the tax side of the reform, that HB3 pushes upwards the state's cost every year in order to reduce some property taxes. So that's a costly provision that you're saying doesn't benefit students directly, right? It's about a property tax reform. It's not, that side of it isn't a school finance reform. And that might play into some of the dynamics we're seeing this year in terms of the potential for school funding cuts, because it's a big commitment on the state's part. It's a big strain on the state budget. So why did HB3 prioritize those ongoing and increasing property tax cuts over future investments in the school system itself?
Well, it didn't prioritize tax cuts over investment in schools. It was a $9 billion package that significantly increased state funding for schools. But as we mentioned at the outset, when there were the multiple problems people were trying to solve for, the state had run into a situation where functionally it had a fixed tax rate and property values statewide have been skyrocketing for decades. And it was frankly becoming unsustainable for individuals, including many teachers who came and testified before the commission, couldn't afford to continue to live in the districts in which they were teaching. This was a problem that was impacting everyone. So at the end of the day, the legislature found a way to balance both, to limit the amount that property taxes could increase while also channeling billions of dollars into outcomes proven strategies or data proven strategies to improve student outcomes. So at the end of the day, I think the lesson is that every area, every state is going to have its own specific scenarios and politics. And, there are some people who don't like the property tax parts, and there are some people who don't like other parts of the bill. And what was really unique is people were able to put aside the parts that they didn't agree with in the name of the parts that they did agree with to enhance the educational opportunities for Texas children.
And I mean, these contentious things are going to remain contentious, right? There's going to continue to be differences of opinion about what was the right thing to prioritize in any conversation. And of course, these things are also iterative. So HB3 was passed. It's not the last legislative session Texas will ever see. And so, I mean, the ridiculousness that is 2020 notwithstanding. And so, I think these conversations about balancing those priorities will continue. We have final two questions that are related about the commission process. So I'll ask them both together. One was, what was the process for community engagement towards the commission? Were there public hearings or town halls? And the other question is, has anything been written to document the commission process and the HB3 experience and outcome for people who are interested in learning more about it?
On the first one, community engagement was essential throughout the process. There was extensive public hearings, sometimes twice a month, but never more than twice a month, throughout the early springtime and into the summer, including like public testimony opportunities for people to come down and travel to Austin and talk about whatever they wanted. But most of the hearings were scheduled around specific themes. So you would have a theme about, say bilingual education, and have national experts come in, state experts from all the different school districts that had innovative programs, and allow a focus on those specific issues so that you could really hone in the minds of the commissioners on how to solve for X on that particular thing. So on to the written product, there was a lengthy report that was written that kind of outlined where Texas stood and what were the strategies to address that. That directly led to the drafting of House Bill 3, which incorporated most of the School Finance Commission report. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, there's no roadmap or process-related product that has been created about each of those meetings and how that went through. But
well, I'm just going to shout out that Ed Trust's Texas State Director, Jonathan Feinstein, has flagged for us that Strive Together did put out a case study on the HB3 process. So thank you, Jonathan. And I'm just sharing that in the chat for everybody. So we're crowdsourcing here today.
Excellent. I look forward to reading that.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us and sharing the on-the-ground perspective, and we appreciate that. I'm going to turn now to return to the screen share, just so that we can talk a little bit more about a tool that can hopefully help others engage in this kind of process that John was just describing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so now that we have learned a bit about the importance of strong funding formula policies and the challenges involved in improving them, I want to share a bit about a resource that can help with that process. So whenever I talk to somebody in state policymaking about their state's funding formula, they always say, okay, you're telling me everything I'm doing wrong. So who is doing it right? Who's got the best model that we can copy? And the answer is that nobody is doing it right. At least nobody is doing every bit of it right. But for every part of the funding formula policy, there is an exemplar state to look to. So there is a report called Common Sense and Fairness that's an attempt to bring together the best bits and pieces from across the nation, model policies for every part of the funding formula with references to where you can find similar policies and state laws around the country. This report was co-developed by EdBuild, an organization focused on school funding policy and equity, in partnership with the Education Trust and Education Resource Strategies. So in addition to a written report presenting all of these policy recommendations in detail with the rationale for each recommendation and the citations to model state policies, there's also an interactive web tool that walks through the process of selecting policies in each area to build the best education funding formula for your state. This could be useful in a few scenarios. First of all, if your state is discussing funding as an issue to tackle, if there's general dissatisfaction with the funding system, or there's a lawsuit brewing that would challenge the funding system, or there's talk of an overhaul among some legislators, this can provide a blueprint. You can assess whether your state's current policy is close to the recommendations or far from them. And you can see detailed descriptions of policies in the areas where you need to make change. The report can also be helpful if you're just looking to address one or two specific problems in your funding policy. As you can see here, the report covers a whole range of key formula components, and you can look at individual sections if they're of interest. So let's say you're hearing quite a lot from parents of special education students that services are chronically underfunded for their kids. Or maybe there's a lot of concern coming from bilingual communities that English learners are not being well served. You can go right to these sections of the report to consider best practices for those parts of the funding policy. Recommendation structure. So for most formula elements, we've sought to offer options. Different states have different conditions and might not be able to be equally ambitious in every area. So the recommendations are offered in tiers. There's silver, which is the baseline of good policy and which usually has many precedents around the country. So what's described in silver is often something that's in place in a significant number of states where you can look for models. Gold would be a stronger, more ambitious version of the policy. It's still out there, still well precedented, but it exists in just one or a few leading states. In many areas, we also offer moonshot policy recommendations, and that offers a path for states that are seeking to do the work of breaking new ground in order to push further towards a policy ideal. So here's an example to illustrate what you might see with silver, gold, and moonshot. And of course, each of these is fleshed out in greater detail in the report itself. But here are the examples of recommendations for how to provide funding, supplemental funding, to support English learners in a state funding formula. So silver, a generous amount of extra dollars, is the minimum to be considered good policy. You need a generous enough amount of supplemental funding to support appropriate instruction, including obtaining materials, developing programs, hiring staff, providing training. All of that is included in the basic supplemental funding recommendation that is silver. Gold kicks it up a notch. It seeks to recognize that different English learners don't all have the same needs. Some are new arrivals from other countries of origin. Some are born in the United States and have been exposed to years of instruction in English. Gold also takes note of different conditions in different districts, different economy of scale issues. So providing programming for English language learners is a different task if the district enrolls just a few of these students versus when there are enough English learners to fill whole classrooms. Moonshot takes those differentiation concerns of the gold recommendation to the next level. So not just students' English proficiency, but also ensuring that districts are set up to meet the needs of students with different native languages, because it looks very different when a district enrolls hundreds of students who are bilingual in Spanish and English than a district that is home to refugees that have come from dozens of countries around the world and speak many different languages. Those are very different tasks to effectively support those students, and that could be recognized in the funding policy. So you can see how the moonshot concept is realized here. Moonshots do tend to increase the equity and precision of the funding formula, but also the level of complexity. As a result, too many moonshots could diminish the transparency of the formula to the public and the ease of calculation. So for that reason, the report actually says that states may want to consider one or two areas where they want to push for a moonshot, high priority areas where the increased complexity is worth the benefits of the next level policy. So if you went to this level of complexity in every area, the formula would become sort of unwieldy, less clear and transparent. On the other hand, in a state that's trying specifically to address the challenges associated with a rising or changing English learner population, this might be the place to go really big on the detail. So what I'm going to do next is take us to a demonstration of the web tool so that you can see how this works. And this is a live tool that you can access today.